I'd like to welcome everybody to the first breakout group and the panel discussion. And if the slides can come forward, please. Yes. So that's a good question. Let's handle that after the breakout, okay? Okay, great. We want to thank the people that are listening and watching digitally. And we noticed some questions coming in, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and handle those after the breakout session. The questions may be answered during the breakout session and the panel discussion, or we might focus in on those and explain them to greater detail. Okay. Still waiting for the slides, but I think I'm going to get started regardless. Okay, so this is the first panel discussion and breakout activity. And the objectives of this panel discussion and breakout activity is first to consider issues encountered when enhancing HPAI AI protection and remaining and being able to demonstrate freedom from infection, and in accordance with the OIE terrestrial code and any other local requirements that you might have in your own country. We've asked the panel to focus in 3 areas. The first area is the types of poultry to vaccinate. The second is the vaccines to be used. And the third is to consider the surveillance systems that will be acceptable to trading partners. So the panel's been working for weeks, trying to pull together all of this information and generate a productive conversation. But as you know, the strategy is that the panel will present and discuss, and then you'll go into breakout groups. And that's where the real discussion is going to occur. Because as you hear these points, jot a note so that when you're in the breakout, you can discuss them with the experts that will be in your group. And then, again, our final goal is very much, can I advance one slide, please? No, we're still getting there. So the goal is to hear possible barriers to the use of broader vaccination, and then to come up with solutions that can help accelerate the acceptance of vaccination as a control mechanism for HPAI AI. And as I said, the panel's been working, preparing for this meeting, and I want to introduce the panel now. And I'm going to walk down in front to do that. Okay, so first we have Dr. Wim Pelgrim, and he's the CVO for the Netherlands. We have Giovanni Catoli. I thought I'd have a slide to help with this. Giovanni Catoli, who's with the joint FAO IAEA Center for Nuclear Techniques in Food and Agriculture out of Austria. And then we've had Dr. Moritz Klemm, who you've already met in a previous presentation. We then have Dr. Jeremy Ho, who's from the Agriculture, Fisheries, and Conservation Department out of Hong Kong. And we've had a lot of conversation about Hong Kong in that program, so he'll be a valuable contributor. We next have Emmanuel Souberon, who's the Chief Veterinary Officer for France. And then finally, we have Francesco Buffante, photogenic, but also with the IZSVE, which is part of the Italian National Health Service out of Padova, Italy. So that's the group, and they're going to offer a presentation, but I want to give you a little bit of background on how this is going to occur. Sorry, as I turn the page. So the way the panel process is going to work is fairly straightforward. Okay, first, the panel is going to present the outcome of their discussions over the last few weeks. And they're going to try to identify issues, potential solutions in some cases, and then areas of debate to help set the stage for the breakout group. And they've got 50 minutes to do that. Then the panel will accept about 5 minutes of clarifying questions, just those questions that you need to be productive during the breakout. Then the breakout groups will adjourn. You'll leave the room or stay in the room, depending on where you've been assigned, and we'll explain that at the end. And we'll go ahead and have the breakouts for 60 minutes, well, 50 minutes probably by the time we're done. So 50 minutes, and you will have a member or two members from the scientific committee within your breakout group, and they will bring some information and they will help get you started in your breakout conversation. But at the end, we're going to ask you to reconvene and give a 10-minute presentation on what your breakout group discussed. So early on in your breakout, you should identify a speaker so that that person can summarize the discussion points that you brought up in the breakout. And you can do it with slides. You can do it just off a piece of paper, however you're comfortable giving the presentation. But we'll ask you just for each group, 10 minutes, sort of say, you know, this is what we discussed. These are the types of solutions that we might want to consider. And then the panel will listen to all of this, and then they'll give some feedback on it so they can help everyone understand what the panel was thinking, and also comment on the good feedback from the panel breakout groups. And then we'll move on with the program. So any really brief questions about the way this is all going to work? No? Great. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to this first speaker, and the first speaker will be Wim.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. I will, together with the French CVO, Emmanuel Souberon, give a short introduction of the world of the CVOs concerning vaccination. And I'll make you a little bit part of our world. As you can see, the flags are gone. Could we go to the slide again? Yes. I'll give you a short introduction overview of the Dutch poultry industry, which is very export minded. An overview of the avian influenza situation of the Netherlands since 2014. And a slide which summarizes all the considerations a minister or ministry has to deal with when deciding whether or not to vaccinate. I'll focus on the role of the CVO in my country. Okay, the Dutch poultry industry. We have around 2,000 poultry farms in our country. The majority is laying hen farms, 650 broiler farms, and other farms that are relevant for poultry production. We export a lot. 70% of our eggs are exported, mainly to Germany. A lot of hatching eggs are exported, and also 70% of the poultry meat is exported. Besides farms, we also have a lot of poultry-related industry. like feed industry, companies that design and construct poultry houses, traders, the financing industry, and of course, the services that has to be done on poultry farms. This slide summarizes the threats and challenges of avian influenza in my country. Since 2014, we cope with introductions of high pathogenic avian influenza in my country. Until 2 years ago, it seemed to be a seasonal problem. In wintertime, we had some years we had introductions of up to 15 a year, and in summertime it disappeared. But the last year, maybe the last 2 years, it didn't disappear anymore in summertime. And even the last 2 months, we see an increase of cases of infected poultry farms. To the left, you see the situation in my country. We are a delta country with a lot of wild water birds. It looks a little bit like an intensive farming system, but it's a reality in a lot of parts of the Netherlands. The right picture shows you the density and the in-between farm transmission. The red areas are areas where the density of farms is that high that without extra measures when dealing with an outbreak, high pathogenic avian influenza will spread in between farms. There are two such regions, the one in the middle and a smaller region in the south of the Netherlands, which doesn't show that good on this slide. In the middle, you see a picture of the Netherlands showing the risk of introduction of high pathogenic avian influenza from wild birds. Last year, we had about more than 100 introductions of high pathogenic avian influenza, with 6 million heads of poultry culled. Almost 25% of them was culled preventively. And in this picture, it shows the risk farms have in which part of the Netherlands. It is based on an analysis that combines the risk of the type of the farm. For example, duck farms and turkey farms are more at risk than chicken farms, and the geographical location. We discovered that there are relations between the surrounding of a farm. For example, is there a lot of water in the neighborhood of a farm, or are there a lot of water birds or pasture in the neighborhood of the farms, and the risk of introduction. And you see the red areas are the areas where the introduction of avian influenza from wild birds is the highest. Well, this picture shows the aspects a minister has to deal with while deciding on vaccination, whether or not to vaccinate. It isn't exhaustive. For example, consumer organizations are not in the picture, or nature organizations, which are also important organizations to consider while discussing whether or not to vaccinate. A minister has to consider all these aspects. So also sustainability, economics, the political aspects. As a CBO, I should focus on animal health, public health, and animal welfare in my country. However, it's difficult to separate these three items from the other items. Still, I'll try to. If I could only focus on those three items, the decision to vaccinate wasn't that difficult. One of the aspects that was mentioned today was the risk for public health concerning vaccination. It's an aspect that has been discussed in my country as well, and it's one of the aspects that might be negative for vaccination. That's why we will carry out in the coming months an analysis to compare the current situations with a lot of outbreaks, a lot of virus spread, with a situation when you vaccinate, where you will have less outbreaks, maybe outbreaks that are discovered slightly later, and see what is less harmful for public health. And we hope, well, I'm sure that the outcome will show that even when vaccine does not prevent completely spread between animals and virus spread, I think it still will be more advantage to vaccinate than not to vaccinate for public health. Well, I'll go back to the previous slide. When you look at the Netherlands and you take these pictures as a start for designing a vaccination strategy, well, it seems quite simple, because you should focus on the poultry dense areas maybe and the red areas. But if you look at the Netherlands, then you might come to the conclusion that it would be advisable from a veterinary point of view to vaccinate the whole of the Netherlands, which is complicated because of all the export aspects that were mentioned before. One thing we found out is that vaccinating only a part of the Netherlands or only a part of the poultry farms is complicated because of the existing structures of the poultry sector. There are a lot of transports between areas in the Netherlands to other areas with live poultry and to other member states, which might influence the not vaccinating stamp on an area if it imports or if it receives vaccinated poultry from other areas. So it seems easy to designate a vaccination plan, a vaccination strategy, but if you go into the details, all kinds of problems pop up. And it was said before, one country should start, but it is difficult for an exporting country to start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll come down. I'm not positive that's working.
Hello. So good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very honored to speak here in front of you. To start my presentation, I will give you some figures on the France production, as my Dutch colleague Wim did before. On these maps, which represent respectively the location of laying hens, the first one on the top, broiler poultry and palmiped, you can see that the west of France concentrate a large, pardon, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't. So you have 3 maps here with the figures of the production in France. And you can see that the west of France concentrates a large number of farms. So you have Brittany, the Loire region, New Aquitaine and Occitanie. And what we can observe is also on the figures that you have on the left side, a large high percentage of free-range farms, which is something that is asked by the consumer. So it's getting more and more important. And also you can see that we have a lot of ducks too, palmiped, which is also something very interesting regarding avian influenza risk factor. Alors, c'est là. Okay. On these slides, you can see the risk factors in France which are shown on the first map, on the map. And these are essentially migration routes and density of the farm. So the risk zone linked to the migration are shown as called ZRP, so near the sea and also near the most important river. And the risk zone link to a high density zone where the risk of spreading is the most important are ZRD. So you have two, one in the southwest, Les Landes, a lot of ducks there for foie gras, and also in Pays de la Loire, in Vendée, where there is also high density farm zone. And these maps have been designed by the Veterinary School of Toulouse and the ANSES, which is our French assessment agencies. And indeed, last year, what we observed is lots of outbreaks in these two areas. So what are the issues that we are facing, and in what context we are evolving? For the last 4 years, crises have been recurrent with increasingly long crises. And last year, for the first time, outbreaks occurred during the ascending migration. So before, until now, until last year, outbreaks only occurred during the descending migration. But this year, we had outbreaks and very hard crises during the ascending migration. And last year, we had 19 million birds culled, and a lot of them preventively. Of course, we have the concern, very important concern relating to this disease, which is, you all know, a potential zoonotic disease. But also at the same time, there are a lot of ethical questions that are emerging. Breeders who are questioning the massive culling, consumer also, and citizen who at the same time want more free-range farming and do not understand this massive culling, especially on healthy animals, and they think it is not sustainable, and it is really seen, and it is indeed, as a waste. The cost of epizootic is also difficult to bear too. And in France this year, if you had all the costs and the compensation, sanitary compensation, economical compensation costs, all what we did, we are now at 1 billion euro for this crisis. So it's quite a lot of money, as you can understand. And at the same time, as it has been said this morning, the vaccine technology is evolving, and we are now able to make the difference between infected birds and vaccinated birds. And that's why in this context, in 2020, our minister questioned the opportunity to use vaccination as a complementary tool, being understood, of course, and it has been said this morning, that biosecurity and surveillance were the two most important tools to prevent highly pathogenic avian influenza. So my colleague Wim has very well described the ecosystem in which we are evolving and the challenges we face and what is the life of a CVO. And what maybe I would like to discuss with you is how to make a decision on a strategy. What do we need to be able, as a CVO, to propose a decision to our minister? And what I think, and what we think, that we need a political will, which is, of course, very important. And we can say that this will was expressed at the May 2022 Council of EU Agriculture Ministers, where there have been a conclusion of the EU Ministers of Agriculture regarding the opportunity to use vaccination as a complementary tool against alipathogenic avian influenza. It is also, of course, necessary to have effective and available and affordable vaccines. And to this end, several countries in EU are conducting experiments, like France, like Netherlands, and also other countries like Hungary and Italy. And as Mr. Dumarché said, you said you need signals, and I think that indeed we need to give signals to companies which will engage themselves in technical solution. But I think this conclusion and also the trials that we are now developing in our country also are signals. Of course, we need scientific assessment, and the Commission explained that we ask for an EFSA opinion, and in France we also ask for an ANSES opinion to help us to build this strategy. So do we want to vaccinate only ducks, because the main problem is ducks in France, because we know that it is a very specific species with not too much symptoms, very long asymptomatic period, and a lot of spreading in the environment? Do we want to, or all species, do we want to vaccinate only specific zones, as you saw, only the very high density zones? So all these questions we ask our agency to propose us some, to evaluate these different scenarios. And of course, the economic evaluation is very important too, because as I told you, the crisis was very expensive, but if the vaccination and the surveillance which is needed for the vaccination is, well, I think we will not go until 1 billion, I hope, but it's important to have all this before designating a scenario and decided for a strategy. And finally, and it is very, very important, because we export maybe less than our colleagues, or proportionate than Netherlands, but we export, and we don't want to stop to export, of course, as you can imagine. So we would like to vaccinate and export. And so, which is very so important, is that we have multilateral and international exchanges, as today, for example, but also we had one in the 30th conference in Qatar for WOA, and there will be maybe some discussion at the general session this year. And also we need to have a discussion with our trading partners. It is very important, because we need to understand their expectation, their requirement. And then when we have done all this, and it takes a little bit time, of course, then we can decide our strategy, and having in mind that our goal is safe vaccination for safe trade. This is the conclusion that we have. On the last slide, I describe, but it's very maybe too small. I described the trial we conduct in France. These trials on ducks. So why ducks? Well, for two main reasons. As I told you, the ducks are very active in the dissemination of the disease in France. And second, there is no authorized vaccines for ducks today in France, in the EU. And so we have a trials with two candidate vaccine, one BI and one Seva. And maybe I will not describe this, but if you want to have discussion with me, I will be very happy to explain what we are doing. And the result will be available at the end of the year, and the report during the first half of next week. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to first thank our CVOs for giving us that introductory information and painting the picture. Next, I would like to ask Francesco to talk a little bit about the vaccines.
Thank you, Ron. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, especially David and Les from the organizing committee. So today, well, now we're going to talk about what drives the decisions behind the practical thinking, that is required to choose which of the many products available or that will be available should be used in which species and with the specific timing over the year or a specific immunizing schedule. I'm just waiting. There you go. Okay, thanks. So basically, okay, let's go with this one. So basically, don't worry. Everyone's wish list for vaccine selection includes one major thing, which is increase the resistance of animals by orders of magnitude. Because the idea is that we get animals that are vaccinated and resilient to infection at the single level, animal level, and premise level. But even if the case of infection occurred, we want our vaccines to be able to reduce the ability of these viruses to spread from one animal that it might have been missed during vaccination to the rest of the well-vaccinated animals. And even if these animals are somehow immunodepressed, we don't want that the environmental load in our premises is so high that these premises will represent a threat for lateral spread. So to do so, we're all very familiar with the concept of high antibody titers, strong humoral immunity, in order to increase the minimum dose that is requested to infect animals. But we also want to look at the other aspect, which is effective vaccines for a strong suppression of shedding. So when deciding which of the many strategies and platforms available shall we use for our animals, we have to be careful that our decision will have an influence, an impact on our ability to gain trust for the market, meaning that we need to safeguard trade with a trustworthy surveillance. And so that's where the DIVA compatible concept of vaccines kicks in. And it's been said before, a good vaccine, especially with the new technologies, will give you a strong humoral response or cellular response against the major antigen, the hemagglutinin. But then once the infection will occur, you will have plenty of serological tools to detect an antibody signal against the rest of the influenza proteins like nucleoprotein, NS1, or the neuraminidase. And today we are in a different position from 20 years ago. Much have changed. What was just in the beginning in 2006, now it's a well-established technology. And here I'm listing some of the vaccines, if not all of the vaccines that are currently being tested in Europe. And I'll just touch upon those briefly. One is the vectorized HVT vaccine. Then we have DNA vaccines, self-amplifying RNA vaccines, and even vector and ND vaccines that are killed, and subunit vaccines, recombinant HAs being injected with an adjuvant in our animals. And these have in common the fact that they will stimulate, ideally, that's the ideal situation, an immunity only against the hemagglutinin of our virus, leaving us with a lot of options in terms of serological surveillance. There are other vaccines. The 95% of the vaccines that in 2011 David mentioned were used at the global level, like whole inactivated virus vaccines, traditional technology, reverse engineered, or virus-like particles. These should not be discarded. Be cautious with these vaccines. They should not be discarded. They are highly stable, thermally stable. They can be applied as boosters. They give high antibody response. But in terms of DIVA compatibility, they might offer fewer options, and these should be considered as well. But then it's very likely that you will intend to vaccinate your breeders, precious stocks, grandparents. And in this case, we will have to take into account that the vaccine should be MDA compatible, so compatible with maternally derived antibodies. And here on top of the list, we still see the vector HVT vaccines, DNA vaccines, self-amplified RNA vaccines, but there are also others that can be used, taking into account that maybe the immunization will not take place at the hatchery, but maybe a week later. And these are the ones indicated here below. So despite, the multitude of technologies, these will probably all be available and licensed in a year or in a year and a half. We will need to consider both DIVA and MDA compatibility, but also the antigenic match. We're all familiar with this concept, but we need more evidence, we need more research, because when we say that a traditionally whole inactivated virus vaccine had a poor antigenic match, we knew exactly what we were saying. The same doesn't apply as of today for other technologies, because other technologies like vectorized vaccines or DNA vaccines, they heavily rely on cell-mediated immunity. And in this case, the broader reactivity that they elicit needs to be fully understood in order to use antigenic maps and landscapes to evaluate these vaccines. So we've just been through a series of these options that we might think of when the CVO will come to us asking for a technical opinion. And another important aspect is that these vaccination strategies should be cost effective, and that will depend on the risk assessment. So we will need to target the right species at the right time, the right place, like the densely populated areas, and the right immunization scheme for each and different poultry category. But we should also take into account that whatever we do, it won't work unless it is farmer friendly. We need to minimize the risk of dropout rates. And we have a good experience with these in Italy. Everything was going well. Then the fact that we were asking meat turkey farmers to pick up the animals a second time, big animals, for another round of vaccination was not a success, exactly. So now I will go through 4 examples, case in points, just trying to recapitulate all of these concepts. And I'm sorry the animations are not here, but you will go through with me. And basically, let's start with the laying hens. So laying hens ideally will require an MDA and DIVA compatible vaccine, but they will also require that we take our animals as little as possible in the field. So a hatchery vaccination, either in ovo or in day old, will be perfect. And for this purpose, HVT vector vaccines are the candidate of choice. And this is a personal opinion, of course. And having said this, it's not enough to think that once we read the papers, they say vaccination is going to get through the entire life cycle of the animals, we're covered. This is not enough. We need to test these vaccines also with field testing and make sure that the coverage will be temporally granted throughout the course of the production cycle. So meaning that these vaccines should be able to cover also during the stressful moments, the beginning of the laying period or at the end of the laying period, where we know that there is a drop in the IgY and cytotoxic T cells response. And so for these, I would personally consider also the necessity of a boosting schedule in these particular moments. If we move to another long-lived animal like meat turkeys with 2 different, take into account the 2 different sexes, so around 100 days and 150 days of farming cycle. This is for Italy as well, at least. Here again, MDA and DIVA compatible is very important, and the HVT vaccines might be very promising because of the, susceptibility of these animals to this infection of the HVT virus. But we should be careful because these are the most susceptible animals in the game. And so despite a shorter productive cycle compared to layers, maybe a boosting strategy could be requested for these animals in order to protect them fully. And if you ask me when these should occur, it could be seasonal, depending on the migratory routes, or year-round. While the laying hens, given the long productive cycle, they should probably be vaccinated all year long. So the options for the boosting strategy, well, they leave aside the HVT strategy and other vectorized vaccines that might suffer from interference from prior immunity. And they leave us with a good array of tools that are listed here. But for those that are really enthusiastic regarding HVT vectors, we should be careful because this is a well-established technology, and it means that many realities are already using this technology to protect their animals against ND, ILT, and IBD. And so we know that when multiple vaccinations with the same platform occurs, either simultaneously or subsequently, they might have a negative impact in terms of interference. So the solutions in this case might be that of opting for a trivalent HVT vaccine, if available, or replace one of the existing HVT platforms with live attenuated vaccines, for instance. Then moving to broilers, there are different opinions regarding vaccination in broilers. These are short-lived birds, 30 to 45 days of age, and then they go to the slaughterhouse. And here, the most important thing is that immunization is as early as possible. It occurs as early as possible, and it must be MDA compatible. So these, in a way, in many people's opinion, would put aside HVT strategy because it takes a month or so to become effective, and maybe opt for other options like DNA or RNA tools that will be available soon in the future, that could be done, that could be applied at the hatchery level, or the use of other tools like the ones I listed on the left side of the screen, like, subunit vaccines, holding activated vaccines, VLPs, that will, though, require a later application in order to be MDA compatible. And then moving on with the ducks, since we are in France, this is at the core of the epidemics in some countries, and as it was mentioned before. And in this case, the new tools, the new technologies could be very promising. The most important aspect, especially for foie gras, is that we get our animals protected by the time we put them outside at 3 weeks of age for the pre-gavage phase. And so immunity should be early, strong, MDA compatible, and DIVA compatible. So it's really high expectations here, and possibly 1 or 2 immunizations with these new technologies could work. We will see the results from the experiments in France, but it should not be discarded that also other technologies could play a game, like the ones that I put on the left side of the screen. So basically, here there was a series of animations, but just follow me. Assuming that we all know that, I mean, it was mentioned before, fit for purpose is a well-established concept for kits, tests, technologies, and diagnostics. We should apply these to the vaccination strategy, not just to single products. And the COVID-19 crisis showed us that it's possible to use breakthrough data from vaccinated populations in a real-time manner and transform this into one of the most useful tools for surveillance and the update of vaccines. We have to learn to do the same for avian influenza, in my opinion. And this will go through an effort at the epidemiological level, to ascertain real breakthrough infections in well-vaccinated flocks all around the world. And it's not for me to say, but in this audience, there will be people that have the chance to think and decide, if we do this, where do these data will fall, in which, in which platform, who will be entitled to do so. And the other side of the story for monitoring whether our vaccination is fit for purpose is antigenic characterization. So monitoring the evolution of the antigens of our viruses, both in the wild bird reservoir and in our animals, will put us in the position to predict with some advance the probable drops in efficacy of our vaccines. And there is a project now within the OFLU network. And if you want to know more, you should go to Professor Ian Brown to know about it, in order to study this in poultry populations. And the combination of these two things will trigger challenge studies, because we need to make sure that these things actually impair the vaccination, the vaccine efficacy. And challenge studies, let me spend a second on these, they come at a high cost, because they should be done in BSL-3 facilities by independent laboratories. And at the moment, there aren't many funds for these. We're not prepared for these. Everyone is doing this usually, leveraging on other funds. And the other aspect for the virologist in the room is that be aware that there are multiple genotypes of these viruses in clade 2344B, and this means that every virus behaves differently. And this has a strong impact on the challenge strain we select for our tests. And then in conclusion, the good news, in Europe at least, we are solving one of the big issues. Everyone is complaining that it takes too long for the regulation to update antigens, even though we have the technical means to do it. This is no longer true. It's been introduced, the veterinary vaccine platform technology master file. So soon as you apply for a new registration of your product, now you can opt for a dossier that will prevent the unnecessary resubmission and reevaluation of your data in case you need to change your antigen. And with this, I apologize for the long presentation, and thank you all.
Thank you for that excellent practical discussion around vaccination. We'll now finish up the panel prepared information with Dr. Ho, who will discuss surveillance issues associated with this topic.
Thank you everyone. Hello and good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Ho from Hong Kong of China, and glad to be here in this meeting, and thanks very much for this opportunity. And on behalf of the panel, I will present the relevant issues in relation to designing an appropriate surveillance system acceptable to trading partners. Thank you. And the ultimate goal of establishing the surveillance system is to facilitate trade of poultry and poultry products with trading partners. In this context, the main surveillance objective would be to demonstrate freedom of HPAI virus in the target animal population in areas where preventive vaccination is applied. Given that absence of disease may not be adequately proven scientifically with absolute certainty, demonstration of HPAI freedom should focus on providing sufficient evidence to demonstrate that even if HPAI virus infection is present, it is present in less than a specified proportion of the animal population. That is the design prevalence. And the design prevalence should be established based on agreements between trading partners, taking relevant information into consideration. For examples, the HPAI epidemiology in the region and existing legislation. In order to demonstrate disease freedom, active surveillance is a mandatory component in addition to any other passive surveillance components in place. For trade facilitation, a stamping out policy shall also be in place in addition to vaccination. Okay, here I show some surveillance methods that could be considered for inclusion in the HPAI surveillance system for where preventive vaccination is applied. First, for surveillance on vaccinated flock, being easy to develop and inexpensive, a passive disease reporting system shall always be in place. In case any suspected case or abnormal mortality is noted, samples should be collected for virological testing on HPAI. And in addition to these passive surveillance components, active disease surveys in vaccinated flock could also provide further evidence to demonstrate HPAI freedom. The sample size for the disease survey should achieve targeted confidence level, typically 95%, and take into consideration of the target population size as well as the performance of the test used. The surveillance frequency should proportionate to the associated risk and agreed among trading partners, and of course also comply with any legislations in place, which we understand that there is a draft EU legislation in these aspects. Virological and serological surveillance could be considered in a disease survey. For virological surveillance, regular testing on vaccinated live birds and or dead birds on a representative number of flocks could be conducted. It is not necessary to do the testing on all flocks. Pooling of samples could also be considered for easier handling and better use of testing resources. And the aim of virological testing is to detect infection of HPIV that may escape from the protection of the vaccine being used, and to detect circulation of other H5 and H7 LPAI viruses, in which the associated risk could then be assessed. As HPAI surveillance in preventive vaccination can be very demanding and focused, H7 and H5 LPAI virus circulation and the associated risk may be missed somehow. So it is therefore important not to neglect surveillance for H5 and H7 LPAI viruses. In particular, in some countries, for example, some EU countries, LPAI surveillance is still foreseen by the legislation. For serological surveillance, regular testing could be conducted to monitor and assess vaccine-induced protection and for antigenic characterization. For example, to have cross-HI test of vaccine antigen and field strength AI viruses against the serum samples collected from vaccinated birds to determine the protectiveness. Serological testing could also be used to evaluate the overall vaccination coverage and seroconversion in the flock to see if it complies with the desired level. Serological differ vaccines and possibly subtype-specific serological tests can be used for detection of any pre-exposure to field strain H5 and H7 AI viruses. And in addition to vaccinated flock, similar surveillance shall be in place for unvaccinated flocks as well, which should also be conducted in accordance with the national and regional surveillance plan as appropriate. Again, a passive surveillance reporting system should always be in place, and the active disease surveys could be conducted in a similar manner to that of the vaccinated flock. Virological surveillance could be carried out with regular testing on unvaccinated live birds and or dead birds on a representative number of flocks. And given that any infection of HPAI in unvaccinated birds would commonly cause death, so focusing virological surveillance on dead birds in unvaccinated flocks may be more cost-effective. Same as the surveillance on vaccinated flock, The aim of virological surveillance is to detect infection of HPAI virus and the circulation of other H5 and H7 LPAI viruses. And serological surveillance could also be considered to monitor and detect any pre-exposure of H5 and H7AI viruses. And when talking about surveillance for where preventive vaccination is applied, some may suggest to use sentinel birds as a surveillance component. The principle is to scatter a certain number of unvaccinated sentinel birds in the vaccinated flock to detect silent infection of HPAI. Although sentinel birds may provide further confidence in the absence of virus circulation, there are certain practical issues that should be taken into account when considering its use. And I would like to take this opportunity to share some experience in Hong Kong to further explain on it. In Hong Kong, we have been using sentinel birds over the past 20 years. On multiple occasions every year, some sentinel birds were tested positive on serology, leading to a thorough investigation of the flocks with temporary suspension on trade, because we will do follow-up sampling of the suspected flock to do PCR to confirm whether there is actual infection. However, none of them has been confirmed as HPAI virus positive over the years. Instead, the antibody response detected were likely due to the cross-reactivity with antibodies against other LPAI viruses, as well as some non-specific serological reactions, which are known to occur in HI tests. So as a result, these cases caused unnecessary disruption to the local poultry trade. In fact, we only had one farm outbreak of HPAI in Hong Kong over the past 20 years since vaccination has been implemented, which was detected via increased mortality in both vaccinated birds and sentinel birds. That farm had modified its management practice to house the sentinel birds together. That possibly facilitated transmission of HPAI virus in the farm and eventually causing the outbreak. As sentinel birds are ultimately managed by the farmers, in which the management practice may differ from farm to farm, sentinel birds might, on the contrary, facilitate introduction and transmission of HPAI if without a good compliance of farmers and a proper management system in place. So in view of this, we have eventually decided to cease the use of sentinel birds, and we actually do not recommend to use it based on our experience. So I think similar issues may also be encountered if sentinel birds are to be used in other places, and I hope our experience in Hong Kong in this aspect would be useful as a reference. The potential benefits and the drawbacks should be weighed carefully if this approach is to be considered. Considering the manpower and resources implications, for example, to collect samples from live birds, as well as to conduct farm inspection, that may come with the surveillance methods that I have just mentioned. Environmental surveillance may be considered as another option to improve sustainability and operability of the surveillance system for the veterinary services, especially when preventive vaccination has taken place in areas with dense poultry population. Environmental surveillance could be considered by collecting environmental samples, as well as air, wastewater, feces, etc. for virological testing. But it should be noted that appropriate validation of the testing methods would be necessary. Apart from farms, hatcheries and slaughterhouse could also be included in the environmental surveillance to enhance HPAI monitoring. It could also be considered in live bird markets, in particular in places with high HPAI risk. And note that any positive results in environmental surveillance should be followed up by sampling of individual birds for further confirmation. And other than the surveillance carried out in poultry, given that wild bird is a major risk factor for HPAI transmission, wild bird surveillance should also be in place, which should be conducted in accordance with the national or regional surveillance plan as appropriate as well. In general, passive surveillance is an appropriate surveillance method of HPAI in wild birds, which could be conducted by sampling of wild birds found dead for virological testing. And additional active surveillance may also be considered when HPAI of has been detected in the region. And the aim of wild bird surveillance is to detect incursion of novel HPAI virus strains and to assess the associated risk. The surveillance methods that I have just mentioned are not mutually exclusive. To establish a surveillance system, a combination of them should be used to achieve the desired surveillance objective, that is demonstration of HPAI freedom, and a multi-layered system may be considered. Combining multiple sources of data could provide an indication of the overall sensitivity of the surveillance system and therefore could increase the confidence of the surveillance results. Moreover, by conducting ongoing surveillance, the surveillance information gathered at different times may provide cumulative evidence of animal health status, which may be further analyzed to provide a cumulative level of confidence on the disease freedom. We did not formulate fixed components for the surveillance system, as it should also consider the country or regional specific HPAI epidemiology and the prevention and control policies being implemented. To facilitate trade, an appropriate combination of surveillance methods to be included in the surveillance system for HPAI should be negotiated between trading partners for acceptable agreements. To further address the manpower and resources issues to conduct surveillance on different animal populations, a risk-based surveillance approach may be adopted to target selected high-risk animal population groups as determined by risk assessments for better allocation of the resources. These high-risk animal population groups are where HPAI cases are more likely to be introduced or found, where HPAI viruses are more likely to spread, or where it would cause more severe consequences if HPAI virus infection occurred. For example, areas with dense poultry population and areas close to wild bird habitats and slaughterhouses. Overall, risk-based surveillance approach offers a more efficient and cost-effective way for detecting HPAI cases. And to facilitate trade with risk-based surveillance approach adopted, it is important to maintain transparency on the decisions made and methods used in the risk-based surveillance so as to allow assessments by trading partners on the accuracy and degree of uncertainty of any assumptions and input parameters used. Another issue of interest on establishing a surveillance system would be the corresponding financial provision. We are providing here is with proposal of financial support for different surveillance targets. For surveillance on unvaccinated areas or farms, wild birds, and slaughterhouses, funding provided by the government is recommended. For surveillance on vaccinated farms, it is recommended for the private sector to take the major responsibility on funding provision with appropriate support from the government. In fact, surveillance would inevitably involve both the public and private sectors, and therefore a good public-private partnership in the surveillance aspect will surely lead to successful outcomes. For example, the public and private sectors could have collaborative investments in research and development for validation of cost-effective surveillance or monitoring strategies, which aims to maintain sustainability and operability of the surveillance system. HPAI vaccine development and efficacy studies would also be an important area requiring both public and private involvement. And to relieve the burden on the laboratory capacity of official laboratories for HPAI surveillance testing, veterinary authority may also consider to certify and authorize approved private laboratories to carry out relevant testing for surveillance purposes. There should be more areas in AI surveillance that public-private partnership could take a role, and I will leave it for your further discussion later. And last but not least, I would like to emphasize that surveillance is an ongoing activity which would require review and reassessment on relevant factors from time to time to ensure that the surveillance system is up to date to cope with the current issues and to fit with the desired objectives. And as I have just mentioned, private partnership is a crucial element of it for a successful surveillance system to be established. It should be in the middle of the diagram, but since the animation is not working, so I can show the public-private partnership in the middle. So, okay, so that's all from me about surveillance, and I'll pass the stage back to Van.
Thank you, Dr. Ho, for that very informative information relative to surveillance. So now we're to the point where you've all been waiting for. This is the breakout session. But a couple comments, first of all, to the individuals that are participating digitally. First of all, you have been sending in questions. Dr. Youngbach is sharing those questions with the heads of the different breakout groups, so that the breakout groups will see those questions and have a chance to talk about those as well. Okay, the second point on the digital side is that obviously it'll be difficult to participate in the breakout groups. Therefore, anyone connected digitally will want to join back again at about 4:15. I'm looking at Maddie, 4:15, where we will resume activities in the main hall here. So those are the two sort of administrative points specific to the digital group. Now I'd like to share with the group here how this is going to work out. If you look at the screen, you will see color-coded breakout areas. So in the main floor here, you can see that the purple group, and you should have color on your badge. The purple group will meet over there. You see Les waving his hand, meet by Les, okay? So that's the purple group. The green group on the other side. Somebody over there, wave your hand, please. Just wave to me. Yep, you. Thank you. The green group's gonna meet over there, okay? Group 3, you're gonna go up the stairs. There will be people out there who will point you directly to where you should go. They may send you outside, who knows? Group 4, you're gonna meet by the welcome desk where you first came in. Again, there'll be people outside directing you. And then the 5th group is gonna actually go out and come up and meet in the mezzanine area here. And that also will be guided by our helpers outside there. So with that, you've got about an hour. You will have an individual from, or 2 individuals from the scientific committee with each of the breakout groups. They will make sure that you're moving correctly, and they will have a piece of paper. And this piece of paper will have the main points that were the subject of the panel discussions to help you come up with solutions for all these issues. So thank you, and hurry to the breakout areas, please, so we can get going. So they would like you to stand over here to speak.
Okay.
But before you start, there was one question that was not able to be shared with the breakout groups, and I'm going to read it. We don't have to answer it right away, but at some point in time during the part of the meeting, we need to answer it. Carmen, please. Yep. Okay, so the question is, the worst situation in terms of vaccination-induced evolutionary pressure being the coexistence of vaccinated poultry in an environment where high viral excretion persists. Does this mean that on a given territory, vaccination of some but not all poultry species could lead to a quicker antigenic change of the circulating virus? So the way that I'm hearing this is that the pressure, the immunity pressure based upon the vaccination and the circulation of virus, the question is, does this lead to a quicker antigenic change in the circulating virus? We're not going to answer that now, but I think the panel needs to think about that and maybe have a comment. Thank you very much. Okay, so are we ready for the first?
Okay.
You set?
Yeah.
Okay, please introduce yourself
Sure.
and then
My name is Chris Pierce. I'm a producer in the United States. I'm in the northeastern part in Pennsylvania. So I did volunteer. I was assured that I would have a very detailed PowerPoint presentation and notes to go over what we discussed. And there's around 6 sentences here. So no, anyways, we had great discussion. Actually, I appreciate having the breakdown sessions, and I wasn't sure. I appreciate that you had all regions of the world. So it wasn't just certain identical regions. And I think we kind of felt like UN delegates because we all had different opinions, and it adds to the complexity of the issue. As we went through each of these, and I'm sure each of the other 4 groups probably will have the same response, that it's a very complex issue, as each of us know, but we will get to a resolution. So first question was to vaccinate, yes or no? And then what to vaccinate? Maybe do you have the questions? I don't know if you can put that slide up rather than the groups. That would be helpful, because I think didn't you have the different questions listed?
We did, but
That's okay.
I don't know. I'm looking at Maddie if that's something that can be put on the screen. I think it's the one that you shared on the piece of paper.
If you don't have it, that's fine. It might be helpful for the other groups too, if we had like question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that's okay. The first question, I believe it was, do we vaccinate? And of course, the resounding answer was yes. But then it was more so, we got focused in 2 different areas. Who's paying for the vaccination? The 2 things, who's paying for the vaccine and the vaccination? And that also tied into surveillance. Even though surveillance is another question, it also ties in, is that going to be the industry paying for this, or is that going to be the governments paying for that of the various countries we were in dialogue? And then we broke into, yeah, we agree there needs to be vaccination, but then it got into, is it geographic regions? If you're a country that is of a smaller size or a larger size, and is there influenza there? So the discussion was long living birds need to be vaccinated from our group. And talked about turkeys, and then talked about layers and broilers, maybe only in specific areas. Again, we didn't reach compromise on this. This was different people's observations and opinions. But there's also discussion on small scale farmers, not those commercial size, but the smaller scale. And could they be ones that don't want to vaccinate? Either they don't have the financial ability or they don't believe in it. And then this ties in, is your country an exporter? Okay, if they're an exporter, do they export all the products, turkeys, ducks, geese, eggs, broiler meat, or do they only export certain products? So that's a little bit more of the compromise then too, is who are you going to require vaccination of? Which species within the poultry industry? The discussion on cost, or who's paying for this, was a deep discussion. I mean, that we started out that way, and we all had different opinions on who's going to do this. Some of the things we talked about, depending on your country, does your government provide any funding already? Are they paying for labor to euthanize? Are they compensating on salvage value of the birds that are being put down? And the discussion was many are, and the cost of vaccine would only be a certain percentage of that total value. So the other part we brought in was the animal welfare part. We as the industry, that's us, whether you're in academia or whether you're in government or you're part of vaccine companies or producers, we understand this, but we know that the consumers out there don't understand when there's mass depopulation of 20,000 birds, 100,000 birds, 5 million birds. So if there wasn't a war in the Ukraine, if we hadn't gone through COVID, we were convinced that this would be a headline news on every one of your newspapers and your TV stations. And it's starting to happen that way. One of our friends from Netherlands said, hey, we lost a couple 100,000 birds, and that was the 8 o'clock headline news. So we're going to have more resistance, more awareness of consumers. I'm concerned that will impact consumption. As an egg farmer, I don't want people to be afraid of eating eggs because they think that we're inhumane to those animals. So I'm off key there. Let me get back to this. So who pays for it? Is it going to be only those that are exporting? So if you're a producer and you don't export, are you going to be required to do this? I think the answer is yes. We talked about this, like it's going to need to be everyone. But the bigger part is going to have to focus on is a geographic region. We talked about risk. Risk reduction was a big part of the conversation, a resounding feedback. Like we have to base your country's requirements for vaccination based on the species and the risk. And that could be, we saw Netherlands, the flyways recovering everywhere. Let's move into the other topics. What was the next topic? There was also discussion about broiler breeders, about will they vaccinate, will they not vaccinate? There was some opposition to them being vaccinated. Also tied into the vaccination program. You have to ring a bell when I'm out of time. So on the,
I'm watching. Don't
okay,
worry.
on the vaccine, we talked about it's going to need to be more than one vaccine supplier. And there's different regimens of vaccination based on where your farm is, the species you have. So it can't just be one fills the need of all. There's going to need to be various options of vaccination. We talked about live vaccines. I understand that the EU does not allow live vaccines. And there was discussion of if it needs to be an injection, it's need to be killed. That's a significant cost aspect. There was focus on no sentinels. We talked about sentinels. There was not support within our group of having sentinels. Other questions? What were the other topics in there? I can remember what they were. DIVA.
Diva, yeah.
There was mixed feelings on DIVA. There was support of DIVA, and there was also concerns on DIVA. I think our gentleman friend from Hong Kong, I think his presentation really helped us understand on sentinels, why not to have sentinels and the risk factors that go along with sentinels. But there was mixed on DIVA. One of the things we talked about was limitations of the diagnostic labs. If we go to, and it's back into surveillance, we know that every country is going to struggle to have the diagnostic labs capable of performing testing if surveillance is a requirement. So then we talked about, look what we did with COVID. We were able to figure out labs and testing capabilities. So how do we build up testing capabilities to support significant volumes of surveillance testing? And we also talked about there could be some backyard flocks that are still considered non-poultry, according to the OIE. And I'm trying to understand that myself. It's presumptive positive, but it's non-poultry. But if they're selling eggs or meat off of that small flock of 50 chickens, is that now a new surveillance zone? Because we're requiring surveillance, and those folks probably didn't do surveillance before. If it's mandated, it's different on surveillance when there's a control zone in place. But without a control zone that you're now doing surveillance, it's very likely we will have a significant amount of additional surveillance positive control zones in place because of that.
Okay.
Other questions, and then I might be done.
You're very close. You're very close to being done. I did have one question, which is when you talked about how to manage the surveillance, the testing, and you said, well, we handled it with COVID. Did you talk a little bit about who would be able to do the testing? Because what I've heard from a lot of people is this is a lot of testing. How's it going to be paid for? But how are we going to bring so many labs up, especially if they have to be official labs?
We did. We talked about they need to be accredited, whatever that means for that specific country, but that could be for private or government.
Okay.
So as long as they meet this criteria of compliance with the accreditation, it's not going to be able to be all government labs. It's going to need to be private university or for-profit laboratories, because the volume, depending on how large your poultry industry is in your country, but that is a significant obstacle that could take a lot of time. The other thing we talk about is like the licensing. I understand, like we're trying to figure out how to get emergency licensing of vaccine. Somebody talked about, we had COVID vaccines licensed within a year. Somebody talked about we had H1N1 for swine licensed in the United States in, I think, 7 months or something like that. So there is fast track capabilities, and that's important.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for that feedback. Okay, great. Let's go to group number 2, the green group, which I believe was over here. Did you have a speaker? Up there. Okay. I'm always checking to see if someone's running out the door,
Thank you. My name is Arjan Stegeman, and I was the appointed volunteer by Ian. And to make it even worse, because I don't want to stand in anybody's career, and to make it even worse, just before I went up here, he gave me the questions we were supposed to answer. So let's see how far we get. As for the first one, the which categories of poultry to vaccinate? Well, we had, I think, as the others, quite a long discussion over it, but I think the consensus was that it's actually more important to see which areas, so which risk areas to vaccinate, than to really appoint the the categories of poultry, because that also may differ from from side to side. As for me, I'm from the Netherlands. A couple of years ago, I would have found this question very easy, because then I would have said, well, it's the long-lived poultry types, because we never saw any broilers getting infected. But that is now really different. So really the area would be the first one to a point, and then within the area, looking well at the capacity you have, then decide which ones you prefer to do there. And that could, of course, still be the longer lived poultry. Then, well, there was a discussion also. One of the persons said, well, we should in particular vaccinate those poultry types with a poor biosecurity. But then there was also opposition there, because it might also be an incentive for having poor biosecurity on the farm. And I think even in the vaccinated situation, we still would want to have a high biosecurity. So risk area importance, and then decide on longer lived types. And you could also give well, exemptions, for example, if it would be parent or grandparent stocks with a very high biosecurity, to make them exempt. There was I think consensus on having it compulsory for the commercial poultry industry, because otherwise in such an area it would not work, because you have too many gaps in your vaccination scheme. But have it voluntary for the backyard system. And the reason for that is that, well, I think many of our countries, we have a much larger number of persons in the backyard system, and it would well take a lot of resources in getting a compulsory program running there. So give them the opportunity, but don't put too much effort in it. Yeah, I think that's a bit it for the first question. At least that's what I noticed. Did I forget anything, Tim? No, Tim is nodding, so then I'm still on track. So which vaccines to be used? Also, that one would be most important to look first from the practical side, because it needs to be doable. And I think for any of our countries, like we were in that corner, it would be very difficult to start vaccinating all poultry well in a certain region, because the turkeys may be too heavy already to just be able to do it. Same is for all kind of laying flocks. So for this preventive vaccination, we thought that the capacity of the vaccines to be applied in the hatchery would be really a prerequisite. And then the group we had was also not in favor of having only one vaccine platform, but actually that we would need several vaccine platforms to be used in also order not to be too dependent on one. Well, that might prove less effective later on, or have some other drawbacks. So then there was and then also the boostering should really be applied in situations where that is possible, for example in the rearing periods, but just to try as much as possible fit into a normal producing cycle, because otherwise, in particular in high labor cost countries, it will just not be doable. Then DIVA was a prerequisite mentioned by, I think, the majority of our group, but still there was also a part that was not convinced that we should have a DIVA system. And the reason is, I think, also, well, a clear one, that the DIVA testing is in particularly focused at serological testing. So now I'm winning time. I'm running also already in the surveillance part, as you noticed.
Yeah.
So you do a serological testing, and then you find positive. So you go back to the flock, try to find virus, and then you find the virus, whereas the flock has been completely or very often you will not find any virus anymore, so it's not helping anymore. But then, of course, Ian helped us out there. He said, "Well, your trading partners might want to know." So from proving that you're negative, it still would be important. But still, it I think brings a crucial thing in this whole vaccination above, and that's, I think, why it was really important to discuss. That if we would have a vaccine that is perfectly capable of preventing dead animals, perfectly capable of preventing illness, but it would not be able to prevent introductions and still have spread. If we have a very good surveillance system, we will still pick up all these infected flocks. Then we will look in the OIE manual and the manual of the European Union. We will have virus. I will report that to him and he will say, well, I need to cull this flock anyhow, because that's in the legislation. So you could run into the situation that you have a vaccine which is really very good from the clinical perspective, but is still not helping us a lot in the disease prevention part, just because our focus is our exposure. So it's also related to the question you had online.
Yep.
Our exposure is from the environment and not so much from lateral spread. So another objective of surveillance, or the most important objective of surveillance, could also be, as we had a turkey farmer in our group, which was very instrumental in having all these kinds of environmental sampling, to at least focus the surveillance as much as possible on trying to prevent lateral spread of the virus to other farms. That would be the most important objective of the surveillance. And then how to do that? I think the group was more in favor of doing that with PCR testing and trying to find innovative things there, that by pooling or by taking environmental samples, by doing that risk-based on dead animals, that would be more effective than doing it on serology, where you would be, well, always a bit late. And then, of course, the final point is, which was the first question here, on the surveillance of the response to vaccination. And there also, I think we did not solve it because we know how to do that in the inactivated killed vaccines, because we just look at the homologous titer. But well, as for the newer platforms, it's less clear how we can establish that the flock is clearly protected. Have I done it sufficiently well, Tim?
That was very great. And he did give you the cutoff. Thank you very much. Okay, group 3, the up the stairs group.
Good afternoon. I was the lucky one to be to have to do this. And we had a very interesting group. We had people from endemic countries. We had people from zero tolerance countries. We had a very, very good discussion, I thought. But there's a caveat before I answer the 8 questions. First one is, as long as they're trade barriers, those questions were difficult to answer, for sure. And the answers to those questions should all be risk-based. And then the third caveat is, who's paying for all this? So I think that comes back to what my predecessor said on each of these questions. The first one was, which classes of poultry to vaccinate? Definitely long-lived long-lived birds, including layers, turkeys, and ducks, but also long-lived broilers for those that go several weeks, not broilers and not primary breeders. So we pretty much agreed on long-lived birds, our group did. The second question was larger operations or all flocks? We had a long discussion about backyard flocks and how we had a public health representative in our group, and she definitely thought that it would be a good idea to vaccinate backyard flocks because of the public health aspect of avian influenza. However, how feasible is it really to vaccinate backyard flocks? With no animal ID system, you go back, the same birds are not there, etc. Backyard flocks can hide virus. It would be difficult to enforce backyard flock vaccination, but possibly it could be done in critical areas where there are densities of commercial poultry. The third question was indoor versus outdoor. And we felt that depended on the country, but that both of them should probably be vaccinated as long as they're long-lived birds. Number 4 question was areas or zone. Would vaccination be done by areas or zone? And those zones could be, you know, density, flyways, what we talked about this morning with the Netherlands and France, etc. And we felt like, yes, countries or states would be likely to have vaccination zones as opposed to state or countrywide vaccination. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit of a political question. Same as number 5, voluntary versus compulsory vaccination. We felt that was very political and very difficult for us to answer because it depends on the country. We felt more strongly on the voluntary side of that question In the US, you know, the US government decides if we can use vaccine to start with, and then the state makes a secondary decision as far as state vaccination. So that system works for us. It will be different in different countries. Type of vaccine, I don't think we ever really got to the bottom of that one. We discussed it for a long time. We want a vaccine that works and that allows for some method of detection of circulating virus. I think that our group was very, very adamant about having the ability to detect circulating virus in a vaccinated flock. And the trust in that test from our trade partners. We talked a lot about trust of the test, trust of who takes the samples, and the trust in the result from our trade partners. We also mentioned under that question, we mentioned the need for more research on the virus passing on to meat birds through the meat to the consumer. Question number 7, who's responsible to make sure the strain is up to date? That would be government or reference labs that would have to make sure that the most up-to-date strain would be in the vaccines being circulated. And question number 8 was appropriate surveillance system. We talked about auditing vaccination through serology. We talked about auditing vaccine effectiveness through research. At the end of the day, I think we felt strongly about continuing active and passive surveillance in vaccinated birds, and that the surveillance system would be scientific-based and economical. But again, we talked a long time under number 8 about the ability to detect circulating virus with that surveillance system. And that's pretty much what I have.
That is great. Thank you. I have one question. Please. You made the comment about the need to have trust with your trading partners.
Mhm.
Did you talk at all about what it would take to build trust in that regard?
Well, we talked about, it was more by examples. We talked, for example, about the PCR. You know, if we decide that we use PCR in a flock at a certain, you know, following a certain schedule, and that flock is determined negative to circulating virus by us, it would have to be acceptable to the trade partners. We didn't
Okay.
really say how that would happen,
Okay.
but it would be very important for this to work.
Yeah, yeah. It just is an interesting, one of the presenters had trust on their slide as well. And I'm thinking about how do you build trust with a trading partner, because it's a little bit technical, a little bit,
Right.
a lot political and everything
political.
like that. So
Yes.
it seems like an interesting challenge. So thank you very much
You're
for that.
welcome.
Okay, we're on to group 4, near the welcome desk. Here comes Dieter. Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Dieter van Kraaienest. I'm a veterinarian employed by a pharmaceutical company, vaccine manufacturer. So that's my background, just for you to know. That's probably also what influenced my notes a little bit. I appreciated how organized the previous presenter was. I did not have the questions listed in order of appearance, but we were taken through a tour of the world by the moderator, which I think was a good thing. So I'll just go through geographies and continents. We started out in Africa, more specifically South Africa. There is no vaccination happening there at present. There's no compensation, but there's a desire to vaccinate birds, mostly the long-lived birds. That's where the big problems are, the layers and the breeders. An HVT vectored vaccine was mentioned as a solution, potentially topped up with inactivated boost vaccines. A big topic of debate there or discussion was the necessity and the importance of compartments, compartmentalization for exports of poultry products to countries a bit north of South Africa. But a comment was also made how expensive it is to maintain those compartments. Then over to the Americas, starting in Canada. Canada has a big outbreak, as we've seen this morning. There's a desire to vaccinate there as well. HVT vectors were mentioned there again, potentially used in a localized approach, not really blanket vaccination. And because the HVT vaccines came up twice, we had a small discussion around, well, isn't that facing producers with a dilemma? If they're using HVT-based vaccines for something else already, as was already mentioned by one of the presenters, aren't we facing them with a choice which is very hard? Are you asking them to drop an HVT IBD-ND or something like that to then use an HVT H5? Because you cannot combine those. So there may be additional technical solutions needed there offered by, probably the pharmaceutical industry to solve that. The US was represented as well. So the US is also a no vaccines zone at present. An interesting comment there was made around the vaccine platform approaches, which would lead to fast tracking vaccines to the market based on alpha virus or baculovirus, for example. And I will just use the desk to turn my page. Over to Europe. The Netherlands was very concerned about exports for all the right reasons. We've seen those numbers on the screen as well, big exporting country. Even going as far as concerns around export of egg whites to Japan, potentially finding antibodies in those egg whites. And then, well, does that mean infection or vaccination? So it sometimes goes pretty far. Lots of concerns also obviously around exports of day-old chicks and hatching eggs. And that then led to discussion between the South African delegates and people from the Netherlands around, well, actually an interesting case report of the CVOs working together to move, I think it was parent stock, from one compartment to the other compartment. So from a compartment in the Netherlands to a compartment in South Africa, which was a successful and positive case to share, I think. There was also a comment made there about the cost of the surveillance program proposed by the European Commission, saying that it was actually a very intensive and pretty expensive program as it was laid out today. Over to the UK, one question that or one quote there that I thought was interesting. The question was popped, is this the end of free range? Free range is very big in the UK, and it is a genuine question over there, apparently. And then another interesting quote, surveillance will default to the country applying the strictest standards. So there may be a race to the bottom or to the top, depending on how you see it when it comes to surveillance, and it may be a political argument at times as well. Then Asia, Azerbaijan was represented. Azerbaijan is considering compulsory vaccination, but would want to see guidelines and was expecting WOA or other organizations to come with clear guidelines to implement compulsory vaccination. And then Saudi Arabia, well, piggybacked a little bit on the UK discussion around exports, saying that, well, if the UK would start vaccinating, then things would get very complicated for them because they would really need to be sure they're importing a lot of hatching eggs and day-old chicks. They would need to be sure that there are no silent infections coming in with those imports. And I think all those trade discussions triggered a bit of a final remark around the importance of having the trade negotiators at the table in these discussions, and they may be a little bit absent maybe in this meeting. The answer there was, well, this meeting is mostly designed to do the technical groundwork and to unify big blocks of countries and then take it to the next stage, take it to WTO or other organization. And I had a summary of summaries for myself as well. So it felt like everybody is standing next to the pool a little bit and waiting for the first one to jump. So it was everyone is looking at each other. That is my take on it. Well, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. I would make a comment that I believe we have a presentation tomorrow morning from the World Trade Organization. So that was a good point to make. And I'm sure that she'll be working on her presentation again tonight. Okay, great. And then we have the last group, the mezzanine group, group 5. And while the mezzanine group is coming up, I'll again, once remember, we did find a wallet up front here in the corner. Is it yours? Okay, great. First round on that gentleman there. Okay, please introduce yourself and then give the summary. Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name in Arabic is Ahmed Osman. If you cannot pronounce it, is Ahmed. I have been working for almost 13 years for veterinary vaccine companies, starting with Zoetis, then Siva, then MSD. And recently I joined a company, its name is Clybic Life Sciences. It's a veterinary vaccine manufacturing plant in Saudi Arabia. Our group was contained 4 different veterinary vaccine manufacturing companies. Okay, and poultry producers, and Dr. Richard Webby. So we will mainly talk, the discussion mainly was about trade, import and export, and public health, or the silent risk of avian influenza. Let's say we need to overcome the barrier of the silent spread and silent risk of avian influenza. We need to take an action with a surveillance, either passive or active surveillance. And whatever the surveillance program is, we need to communicate it with the public health or the authorities that it is in need to know this surveillance program. We need a full assessment of this program and communicate it with the trading partners to gain the trust. So I heard your question about the trust with the trading partners, how we can get it with communication, clear communication about everything that either the outbreak, if it is there is avian influenza outbreak in the country, or the vaccination program, the vaccination strategy, if you opted to take this decision to vaccinate against HPAI. And we need to normalize the flu vaccinated animals for trade. Like other diseases, we already have birds that are vaccinated against Newcastle disease, against infectious bronchitis, against mycoplasma, against several other diseases. So we need to normalize it. The avian influenza, it is the same. Let's say you get in the countries that importing, for example, fertile eggs from other countries in Europe or in the Americas, we can say to the end consumer, it is free from mycoplasma. Let's normalize that it's free from influenza. Okay. Also there is no much difference between the mycoplasma and avian influenza, disease-wise. It is free from mycoplasma, it is free from influenza. And when we look at the transportation of animals worldwide, disease already exists, and it is causing massive losses and great problems. So we guess that vaccination will not make this problems or losses much worse, but it will work on a solution, or getting to a solution to it. And every day in the morning, we get or read new reports about avian influenza outbreak here and there. And vaccination is not going to make these reports more, but we think it is going to make these reports much less. And looking to the estimated cost of these losses, there is direct and indirect costs or losses regarding to HPAI, the real costs, direct or indirect, regarding the culling, the feed plants, the broiler producers, every single party involved in the business indirectly affected by these losses. So it needs to be compared to the estimated cost of a vaccination program. Is it going to be more cost or less cost if we implemented a vaccination program? And the quote from at the end is from the leader of the group or the panelist, that we need to stop talking and start making an action and plan to find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's the feedback from the breakout groups. Does anyone in the audience have any clarifications or comments they would like to make before we ask the panel if they have any feedback? Yeah, okay, great. you want to do it or do you want me to?
Okay, or whatever. So there was a question from remotely. What is the impact of repeated HPAI outbreaks on financial lending abilities and poultry production capacity? There is real interest in having a kind of answer.
Is there somebody in the panel that feels comfortable answering that question? I'll read it again. What is the impact of repeated HPAI outbreaks on financial lending abilities and poultry production capacity? Any thoughts? Is this something that anyone has experience with? And if not on the panel, maybe in the audience, because there are some poultry producers. Oh, hold on a second. I'll bring you the microphone, okay? Oh, if you do that, thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name again is Chris Pierce from the United States. So we did lose 2 farms. We lost flocks in April and May, 2 nest run farms, egg layers. One had 400,000 birds and one had 80,000 birds. Financially extremely challenging. So in the United States, there's compensation for salvage value. So kind of if you wreck your automobile today and it's 5 years old and it's worth 15,000 euros, but it costs you 50,000 euros to buy a new one, they give you the 15,000. So you have to come up with the other 25,000 or whatever it may be. So economically, it's very challenging. So my point is, how many times can you go through that? So, so it's not just the bird value loss, it's also the employees. There's no income. So there's no business interruption insurance. So how do you continue to pay your employees, their wages, their health care? You still have your debt on the farm. You still going to have like all the costs go along with the transition until we repopulate. So for the one farm, the first flock came in, it's 4 barns. So because we have multiple ages on that farm, but it'll be a year until we fully repopulate. So at 6 months, we're at 25%, then it will be a 50% capacity in 9 months. So it's gradual. It's a significant hardship. And that would be our personal hands-on experience, as well as our neighbors are making a lot of money now because there's 10% of the hens, 1 out of every 10 hens in the United States died. So there's a shortage in egg supply. So the survivors are doing well, but they live in fear. I was at a conference with the American Egg Board 2 weeks ago. Very solemn. It can be any of us. It can be any, if you're all producers, it can be any of you that could be the next farm to break. So it's mentally and physically challenging too.
Great, thank you. And one follow-up question that I think was part of this one. Did you see feedback from your lenders that would have said, we're now more aware of this risk?
I have not, but that is a concern.
Okay.
That is a concern from lenders, whether it's large scale robobank or it's going to be small regional banks. It is a concern. It gets into the risk. The same thing we're talking about vaccinating based on risk. They're going to look at us as potential clients that they're loaning money to. What is the risk to us? So it ties hand in hand.
Oh, yeah. Wait a second. We need to get the microphone so that people digitally can hear.
Thanks, Vaughan. We lost 5 farms for about 250 million rand. We were compensated initially and then afterwards not again. Farms stood empty from 9 to 16 months. The banks gave us no assistance. So you've got a feed account, you've got a chick account, you've got medication accounts. Some of those people gave us extra days, 60, 90 days. But some of the farmers were empty for 9 months. And there was no compensation, no help from anybody in purpose of that. So when you look at from that perspective and you're saying, I want to vaccinate, I'd rather vaccinate and deal with the fallout than have to deal with sitting with 5 families facing bankruptcy. And as a veterinarian, I've got to go to them and say to them, listen, I'm going to kill your farm and put you out of business. How do you do that? And not just that, the staff that had to destroy the animals themselves, they needed counseling afterwards for months because they saw their own livelihood going down the drain. Every bird they euthanized was them out of a job for the next 9 to 12 months. So, I find it strange that we talk about these things, but besides food security, it's agricultural security we're talking about. Because once that farm is given up and gone, nobody is going to replace him.
Good point. Thank you for that. Okay, The panel, have you heard anything in the presentations of the breakout group that you'd like to respond to? And you may want to volunteer to do that because I have a couple things in my head that I might ask you about.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the feedback from the panels. There were a couple of things that I noted down. There was one comment that the EU program on surveillance was very expensive and very demanding, and that's certainly true. It is very demanding. It is a conservative and cautious approach based on the best available advice that we have currently. That's the let's say EFSA advice from 2007, and it's based on the directives that we have had in the past. And as long as we don't have any update on that, we felt it was safer to stick to those rules that were in place, previously. That's one thing. And those rules, by the way, are totally in line with the WOA standards. So the WOA standards very explicitly ask for testing of each flock that has been vaccinated. So that's something that we have included, of course, in our rules. And very often we hear the surveillance requirements are too demanding. They should be lighter. And at the same time, the same people that give us that feedback say, well, we should also continue international trade. So it's kind of, I mean, you cannot have a very light surveillance and then expect to continue international trade. There needs to be some match there somewhere. And but that's certainly, we're open, of course, for discussion, and things can certainly be improved in the future. There was also the question, who jumps first into the pool? That's a very good question indeed, and perhaps not everyone should jump at the same time. There's maybe some advantages if some people would jump, but not asking or not making vaccination mandatory in all production sectors in the whole country. If you start small in certain, let's say, niches, something that we already have now, where you have vaccination of zoologic collections of rare breeds, things like that have already, where some experience already exists. And if you start to expand that and start small in some areas, some sectors, and then scale up, maybe that's a way to go to gain some experience as you go along. There was also the question of the live vaccines that will be prohibited in the EU. Well, this is actually live avian influenza vaccines. We don't want those to be used, whether attenuated or not, simply because they're not recommended by the I was going to say by the OIE, by WOA. In the terrestrial manual, there's it explicitly says that those vaccines should not be used, obviously, for safety reasons. What else do I have? The zones to vaccinate, what zones, how many are, zones, or the whole country. And this certainly also depends on the vaccination strategy. I mean, if you have outbreaks in an area and you want to use vaccination as a control tool and to prevent further spread, then that obviously would typically be in a certain zone, and you would not start vaccinating in the whole country. Whereas, so that would be emergent in our jargon, it would be emergency protective vaccination. Whereas if you do preventive vaccination in a country, in an area that is free of the disease, then obviously you could opt to go for larger zones or the entire country. There was also the issue of DIVA, yes or no. In fact, we are quite flexible on that in the EU rules that will be put forward. We don't prescribe DIVA. It's certainly an option, obviously, if it works, because DIVA so far, I know enough examples where the testing itself doesn't always work. Anyway, it's certainly not something that we would prescribe. We would leave that up to the member states to decide what the best option for them would be. So the EU rules are quite flexible on that. I think that's. Oh, and there was the question on the control zone with the 50 birds. That's not really linked to vaccination. In fact, if you have outbreaks in small, what we call captive birds, so that would be, for example, ornamental birds, pigeons, or some very small backyard flocks. You would not, the member states do not need to take all the measures that you would need to take in a very large commercial farm. But you know, this is not really linked to vaccination. And I think that's all I had. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Other comments from panel members, please.
I have a comment on, I see a lot of discussions about the species to be vaccinated and several groups. While there is a general agreement, I had the feeling on the species with long production cycles, or the categories with long production cycles like turkeys or layers. I notice a sort of polarization of opinions between for the broilers, for example. It's yes or no, but I believe what is important, and I think the Arjen and his group raised this issue, is I believe the decision, for example, concerning broiler or concerning species in general, should be really based on a risk assessment. For example, if the broiler production represents a large proportion of the poultry population in your selected vaccinated area, and you're dealing with an epidemics where the viruses, where the broilers are susceptible to that particular strains, I believe there is no reason to exclude broilers from vaccination. And this also brings back to the question from someone in the digital audience about driving, antigenic drift, etc. What we don't want is to leave out a category of susceptible birds out of vaccination, because this is really, to me, in my personal opinion, can really lead to evolution of the virus jumping in the same area from vaccinated and unvaccinated birds. So I think it's really based on risk.
Perfect. Thank you. Dr. Suber.
Yes, thank you very much. So all the questions and comments that the groups raised make me feel better. And after this meeting, I don't feel alone anymore. So thank you very much for that. But more seriously, listening carefully what have been said, I think that what I realized is that we have two kinds of topics. There are topics which really are to be decided at national level. And it depends on the risk, on the situation, geographical situation, economical organization of the filière. And for example, the question who pay, it depends on what is the habit in this country, what is the political, it's often a political issue. Is it the farmers who has to pay, or is it the citizen who has to pay by taxes, huh? Or is it the states who pay? So these are really topics that really only can be decided at national level. And on the other hand, you have topics which are more universal, and something which you mentioned is the question of trust regarding surveillance. And on these topics, which is linked to the trade, on this topic, we need to work together, and we need to work at international organization level. I don't remember, but one country said that it would be nice to have maybe guidance at WOA level. And I think indeed it could be interesting. And this is a key issue, the question of trust with trading partners, trust with public health sectors, and trust also with consumers. And then we also need a collective action regarding the surveillance network that we need to renforcer, to strengthen. It's a difficult word to say. And I was especially thinking of OFLU and all what we have to do together. So it's a mix between really individual at national level decision and collective action, and the meeting we have today is very good to understand what collective action we should do to lever les barrières, hein, to leave the barriers. Yes, thank you. That's what I wanted.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Wim is going to compliment that. No.
Thank you. Just a short comment. A lot have been said already. I'm like Emmanuel. I'm glad that I had this meeting. It makes me feel more comfortable as well. Hearing the feedback, I think we are with 80 CVOs in the room, with which all see the problems around vaccination and the difficulties. One thing I would like to comment on. It was said several times now that someone has to jump first, and we might make that process easier because I don't think any country will start next year vaccinating all their poultry. It will be very difficult in many ways, but it might help if smaller initiatives in which countries make pilots to try to vaccinate their poultry within a smaller risk region wouldn't be punished internationally. And we should disseminate this message, I think, in our countries to stimulate those initiatives instead of punishing them, and to learn from them in a scientific way, but also in a trade way, that vaccination is not a dangerous thing, but it can help us. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And they're applauding because you just promoted them all to CVO. And so they're going to assume an increase in pay.
Well, thank you. I have some comments about one of the points that I think is quite important raised by Group 2, which is about to have more than one vaccine platform to cope with the changes in effectiveness and the possible drawbacks afterwards of the vaccine later on. To share some experience from Hong Kong, as I have mentioned before, we have been implementing a compulsory HPAI vaccination program for 20 years. And over the past 10 years, actually, the HPAI vaccine used on farm, we have changed for 5 times already. So just to use more updated HPAI vaccine in poultry to cope with the circulating strains in the region at that time. That is around where we change it once around every 2 years. So because AI viruses is ever changing, so it is reasonable to expect that the appropriateness of the vaccine being used would need to be reviewed regularly, and sometimes you may need to review it frequently. So for example, because I just talk about the past 10 years and we have already used vaccination for 20 years. And in the first 10 years, we actually used the same vaccine. And I have also mentioned that we have one farm outbreak in 2008 of HPAI. Actually, the farm investigation, the outbreak investigation afterwards revealed that the vaccine is quite mismatched with the strains that infected the poultry at that time. So that's why it's triggered our review afterwards and the subsequent update of the vaccine as well. So I would say that there's no single vaccine could be used forever for HPAI, and this should also be considered. And it is a very important point if vaccination is going to be considered in your places or country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions that we had earlier digitally had to do with the level of immunity in the different species. And I believe that we've already had a chance to answer that. Dr. Youngbach, are there any other questions that haven't had attention?
Only this long one from Nick, but we can have it as a panel discussion for more.
Okay.
It's better with this item.
Okay.
So if the panelists can have a look on it.
Okay, good. So we'll make sure that the panelists see the question and then can incorporate that into their comments tomorrow. And that'll be panel number 2. I'm looking at you, Carol. I caught her by surprise. I'm sorry. Okay, great. Any final comments from the panelists? If not, I would like to thank everybody on the panel, and I'd like to get them one more round of applause. And then I believe it comes over to Ian to wrap up.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, because we're moving into the evening. So I'm not going to keep you very long. I'm sure you've got plenty of other things to do than listen to me, but I think it's worth just reflecting for a few minutes on where we've come today. A huge landscape of activity and issues. And I think the panel discussion has been great in that we flushed out, well, there's no one size fits all, and there's a lot of variance of opinion depending on where you come from. But I think just to reflect, we heard from David Swain at the start of the day about why we're all in this room today. I think we all know that anyway, but it just reinforced that we're dealing with a huge problem and that vaccination can no longer be put on a back burner, that not having a utility as a tool. We know that we're dealing with a global fire and it's getting worse. And then I think we had a really insightful view from Les on there's a lot of myths out there. And I think hopefully Les went some way towards convincing you that actually a lot of those things are not barriers and we indeed can find solutions. We then moved on to consider the wider issues and we had lots of perspectives. So we had the European Commission, we had WOA, and you know there is a framework there already that we can utilize. We just need to be brave, as Wim said, to take that jump and find the first steps to using that framework. The vaccines out there, we heard from Erica that there are vaccines, there are good vaccines. We understand totally the industry's perspective, very fair and direct points. If there's no market, there's no product, but there is a lot of R&D going on, and we know that there's a real, I suppose, tsunami of effort in this space. So hopefully those issues that were raised that are very valid concerns, we can take away from here and they can genuinely be addressed. Then we moved into the technical issue about surveillance. So we heard from Tim Harder, Jack DeVere about systems and tools. And actually, there are a lot of systems and tools, and probably some of them could be refined and tweaked. But actually, we do have a toolbox. And then reassuring, we heard from Richard Webby that actually public health are not seeing this as a risk. That was the take-home message. You know, there's assurances there, there's tracking and there's monitoring. Yes, surveillance and monitoring keep being mentioned, but they're of course vital when you've got a very elastic virus such as we're dealing with at the moment. And then, of course, that took us to our panel discussions. And I think I would like to thank everyone, and I'm sure on behalf of the organising committee, the scientific committee, it's genuinely been, everyone's been chipping in and participating. And we want you to keep doing that tomorrow. Because as we said in the introductory remarks, this is about getting the perspective from all of you out there and helping us work through what are these problems and what are the solutions. So I think we've had an excellent first day. Have a good evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow morning, bright and fresh, ready for another day. Thank you.
A couple of quick announcements as you're gathering your things and ready to go. We've got an announcement regarding travel and food, so you may want to listen to that. I would also like to make sure that everybody's aware of our sponsors. If you haven't seen them on the ebook, I wanted to mention that Siva Animal Health at the diamond level, Merck and Boehringer Ingelheim at the platinum level, Zoetis at the gold level, and AVMX, Royal GD, Innovative Diagnostics, and the International Poultry Council and Vaccinda at the silver level are all of our sponsors. So please thank them for me. Before we learn about travel assistance and dinner, I'll remind everybody that we'll start promptly at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I'd like to apologize for the technical difficulties that we have had today. And at the same time, I would really like to thank our IABS staff led by Maddie Cox and the technical team for making it all happen. And so announcements, Maddie, from you.